Hello and welcome to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen, and I'm joined today by Dr. Brian Clowes, our Director of Research. Welcome to the podcast, Brian.
Thank you. This is great to be here.
It's wonderful to have you on today. I'm really excited for this topic because today we're going to be talking about the global depopulation agenda, specifically for National Security Study Memorandum-200, aka the Kissinger Report, which was finalized on December 10th of 1974, so just about 50 years ago. So this is our 50-year commemoration in a bad way of reminding people that this has been going on for 50 years and that the U.S. government has been funding a depopulation agenda around the world for 50 years. So
Right.
it's an incredibly important topic, and hopefully this will be a very interesting and informative episode for our audience. So, Brian, before we dive into the content of the depopulation agenda, what led you to begin researching the Kissinger Report?
Well, I like history, and I started looking into the background of the population control movement, and I found that it has three historical waves. The first wave was awareness. We started out with Reverend Thomas Malthus back in 1798, who wrote a little essay called An Essay on the Principle of Population. And there he says that the population of the world is growing geometrically, while the food supply is only growing linearly. So in other words, the food is only going up like this, the population is going up like this, and when they cross over, we're going to have mass starvation. He couldn't predict exactly when that would be, but it would be within the next 50 or so years, they estimated.
Mm-hmm.
The second person, one of his contemporaries, was the Marquis de Sade, who was the first person in his work, Juliet, to talk about how we should legalize abortion all over the world because it's a woman's body, which I found very interesting because he was not only a depopulationist, he talked about France will starve in the future, but he also was the first person to advocate for legalized abortion. Makes
Interesting.
him the godfather of the pro-abortion movement. The second wave was activation back in the 1920s, and this was Margaret Sanger with her American Birth Control League, which soon became the Planned Parenthood Federation of America and International Planned Parenthood Federation.
Mm-hmm.
And she had a magazine called the Birth Control Review, and the masthead said to create a race of thoroughbreds. So she was a eugenicist.
Wow.
Across the pond in London, we had Marie Stopes, who also had a magazine called the Birth Control News. And hers was Joyous and Deliberate Motherhood. The slogan was a sure light in our racial darkness. So she was
Wow.
not only a eugenicist, she was very severely racist.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a very interesting person who backed up Sanger was Harvard professor Lothrop Stoddard. He wrote a book called The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy. And he was afraid of the demographic cross, where Africa would soon become more populous than Europe. That actually happened in 1997.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this book that he wrote in 1921 is still a favorite of racists all over the world, especially in North America. And he wrote that none of the colored races shows any perceptible sign of declining birth rate. They all breed up to the limit of available subsistence or food. And this means one thing, a tremendous and steadily augmented outward thrust of surplus colored men from overcrowded colored homelands. The Negro strikingly displays his prepotency for black blood once it enters a human stock is never really bred out again. Then we have the third wave of activism, which started in the late 1960s. Now, the Sierra Club published Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb.
Mm-hmm.
He made 80 major predictions, and they're very specific.
Mm-hmm.
Every one of them was wrong. Not even one of them was close.
Wow.
And my favorite is that he said that by the year 2000, 90% of all Americans will starve to death and will have a population of 23 million.
I'm glad
The
that didn't
actual
happen.
number was 279 million.
Mm-hmm.
The second important player was Frederick Jaffe, the vice president of Planned Parenthood. World Population wrote to Bernard Berelson, the president of the most influential population control group in the world,
Okay.
the Population Council. And he said we should encourage increased homosexuality because it decreases the fertility rate. We should put fertility control agents in the water supply so everybody's sterilized. And we should have programs of forced abortion and sterilization, except for the elite. And
Ha-
this was stated in 1969.
Has that been carried out?
In some countries, it has been. We've had 23 countries with forced abortion programs.
Hmm. Well,
But
obviously, we've had increased homosexuality and transgenderism now with the
mm,
LGBTQ movement. What about the fertility disrupting agents in water? I know that birth control isn't filtered out by a woman's liver, which is why it ends up in the water
right,
supply.
right.
Is that like how toxic is that? How much do you think that affects fertility?
Well, if they wanted to do this, but it was found to be impractical because they just needed too much of it in order to be a big enough concentration to have any effect. Plus, they said it was bad for the cattle. It's
Okay.
not bad for people; it's bad for the cattle.
The birth control,
Yes,
you mean? Okay.
yes. So if you look at one of these big 18-wheelers that come into a gas station,
Hmm.
sometimes you see them filling up all the tanks there.
Yeah.
That's about 20,000 gallons on average.
Hmm.
Uh, that's how much in the way of these powerful hormones is put in the birth control into the rivers and streams of our country every year
Hmm.
from the women eliminating them.
Okay.
And so we have entire rivers and ponds where all the fish are turning female
Hmm.
and all kinds of effects we can't even imagine.
Okay.
But the environmentalists don't want to talk about this because they consider, reproductive rights to be even higher on their priority scale than the environment.
When you said it wasn't effective, do you mean that what wasn't effective? The birth control wasn't effective, or
Yeah,
putting it in the
it
water
would be
supply?
diluted too much if you put it in the water supply.
Okay.
So just imagine millions and millions of like a small lake trying to get that up to a concentration of birth control pill
Hmm.
type hormones, which would be effective. They wouldn't work at all.
Okay.
So the
So,
concentration would have been too great.
mhm,
They would have needed tons of this stuff
yeah.
to have any effect at all on
So what
human
is going
fertility.
into the water supply then is negligible and it isn't necessarily affecting birth fertility?
Relatively negligible.
Okay.
Yes, yes. It's probably only about 1 to 1/10 of 1% of a concentration they'd have otherwise. But it
Okay.
still has a tremendous effect because of what I just talked about, the fish
Hmm.
and so on. And possibly it's one of the causes of decreased male fertility
Okay.
because now all the men are drinking these birth control hormones as well.
So what ended up going into the water wasn't enough to stop women's fertility, but it was
Mm,
enough to disrupt fertility.
right,
So possibly
right,
decreasing it by causing infertility by decreasing sperm rates or affecting
right,
women's hormones.
right.
Wow. Okay. That was a little tangent, but I think that's a really interesting one that I definitely would like to talk more about on the podcast.
It
So,
is. And one other thing about the history in the early 1970s, we got Hollywood in on the act too. So we had some
mhm.
really interesting movies like um, Soylent Green with
Okay.
Charlton Heston. And they said by the year 2022, or the 50th anniversary of that movie, that people would be eating people. Yes,
Wow.
very interesting movie to watch. And another one is 1972, also zero population growth.
Hmm.
And on the publicity posters, it says, "Smog covers the earth, the oxygen is depleted, love is encouraged, but the penalty for birth is death. The time is tomorrow, and there's no time left." So I have this list of all of these environmental predictions, over a
Hmm.
hundred of them, by famous people like Paul Ehrlich and Al Gore. Not one of them has turned out to be true.
Yeah. This was like a big movement at that time period too of being
Oh yeah.
concerned about overpopulation,
Oh
right?
yeah, I remember it very clearly. In fact, my dad told me that my wife and I should stop having as many children because the environment would be afflicted by it.
Well, and that still carries to today, except for now
Mm,
it's like the concern is more, oh, what's going to affect climate change? They use the concern about climate change to either fearmonger people into not having children
mm.
because you don't want to bring children into a world where climate disasters happen, or you shouldn't have children because that's causing the climate change. So they still use this hype around the environment to
Oh
push an
yeah.
anti-natalist agenda now. It just seems like the way that they were approaching it was slightly different back then. So what is then so you have setting the stage, we have these driving philosophies of the depopulation agenda. What was their goal?
The gold was essentially, we have to talk about TFR, total fertility rate.
Okay.
Back in the 1960s, the average woman had 4.8 children per
Mhm.
family. and the population was increasing by about 2.2% a year. And 50 years of anti-natalist propaganda have done their work because now the world is just above replacement at about 2.2.
Hmm.
So we dropped that by the TFR by more than half. And now we have the population increasing by about 0.7% a year.
Hmm.
According to the UN, in about 30 years, it'll stop growing completely.
And that growth is mostly happening in places like Africa and Latin America, I believe. Because I
Yeah.
know that in
Yeah.
Europe and in the US, it's down below replacement rate.
Yes, it is. The US is right at replacement rate. Western Europe, 1.4. And that is phenomenally low. You see people walking around in the big cities like Vienna and Hamburg and Paris and others I've seen in these big baby carriages, and they have dogs or
Mm-hmm.
cats instead of human
Hmm.
being their children. So Africa is still having about 4.8 children per woman. It used to be 7.
Hmm.
Asia slightly above replacement, and that's where nearly two-thirds of the world's population live. And South America is below, Europe way below, North America right at it, Oceania a little bit below. So we're seeing dozens of countries have tried to reverse the trend.
Hmm.
And not one of the 30 or so that have tried to give rewards to having children has been successful yet because the people say, oh, what are you doing here? I $10,000, or a cut rate apartment or a new car. For
Hmm.
50 years, you've been telling us the babies are bad for many different reasons.
Yeah.
And it's going to take like 30 or 40 years of pro-natalist propaganda before you turn people's minds around.
I
It's
think
only common sense.
Father Bouquet has mentioned before, like the anti-child, like juggernaut that we have are up against, where it's just like 50 years of every direction, like the
Yeah.
politicians, Hollywood,
Mm.
the experts, quote unquote experts in their field, all saying that having children's not a good idea, or having
Yeah.
many children is a bad idea.
It was a bad idea. They've been telling us that for many, many years.
Hmm. What is the strategy of depopulationists then?
Well, the ultimate goal is to get the total fertility rate down as much as they possibly can.
Hmm.
And by doing this, the two primary points they have to work on is to infiltrate the power structures. So we have 10 major power structures in the world today. The international ones, like the big NGOs and the United Nations. Then in every country, you have the national government, you have the provincial or state governments, you have the judicial systems, you have the big medical and legal firms, the educational associations. So I have 8 of the what I call focused sources of influence, and they take over those.
Okay.
And then they force themselves down on the other two, which are the church and the family, the
Hmm.
diffused sources of influence. The difference being that the elite controls those 8 uh, organizations or conglomerations of organizations that I've talked about. The elite controls those, while the church and the family you have many millions teaching many millions of others.
Hmm.
And the key to stopping all of this is by strengthening the church and the family and making them invulnerable to whatever the elites say.
Hmm.
So you see people like Ted Turner saying we should only have one child. He's got 5 children himself. You see Obama and Gore talking about the oceans are going to rise and drown everybody. And yet, what do they do when they retire? They get these enormous mansions right on the seaside. So they don't really believe what they're talking about. It's all part of, you have to say these things if you're going to be accepted in polite or rich or elite company.
That's, yeah, that's a good point. The hypocrisy that's there, and that this is an agenda that really, to be successful in worldly standards, you need to be able to adopt. What was the motivation behind population controllers? Was it simply from this misguided altruistic idea
Mm,
that the earth was going to be overpopulated, and so for the sake of humanity they have to do something about it, or were there more malicious
mm.
intentions behind it driving it all?
Well, there are 5 primary motivations. Self-hatred, a hatred of the human race.
Mm-hmm.
We're destructive, we're evil, we're wiping out a million species every year.
Mm-hmm.
I've actually seen people say we're wiping out a million species every year when you have a total of 3.2 to begin with. The
Mm-hmm.
actual number is about 35, and they weren't entirely due to human activity. The fear of famine in the West was as big back in the first half of the 20th century. Environmentalism, which can be good or bad depending upon how you go about it. But we've already mentioned the second one, which is racism.
Hmm.
There are a million less white people now than there were at this time last year. And since the white race, I tell people in Africa, since we white people have one foot in the grave, the only way we're going to be able to keep our power is by pulling all the rest of you into the grave with us. So the white race is starting to lose its influence because it's losing population. We want to do that to Africa especially. But the primary motivation behind population control is greed. Because although the West, the rich countries, only have about a quarter of the world's population, they use up two-thirds to three-quarters of the world's resources.
Wow.
So we have to be out there telling people stop having children
Hmm.
so we can get our hands on your natural resource. And that's what NSSM-200 was all about. The subtitle was Implications for Overseas Population Growth on U.S. Security and Economic Interests. So the more people there are in the so-called developing or the third world, the less good stuff we can have because they'll keep it for themselves.
And now, going off of that with NSSM 200, which was a good transition, I believe that it was written by the National Security Council and the CIA and the Department of Agriculture. Is that
Department of
correct?
Agriculture are three of the major organizations consulted.
And then it was written under Nixon in 1974
Right, right. With
by Henry Kissinger.
he was the one who was the Secretary of State at the time, so he was a honcho. He was the one who directed the whole thing.
So that's why it's called the Kissinger
Yeah,
Report.
yeah.
Okay. Could you then tell our audience what the purpose of NSSM 200 was, unless there's anything else that you think is important for them to know before we dive into the content?
Well, I think before we get into that, I'd like to mention there are two ways to control a person
Okay.
or to control a people. And
Hmm.
Homodo Kane, the Senegalese novelist, talked about this in his novel, Ambiguous Adventure.
Okay.
He was one of the first ones to tumble on this idea that look what they're doing to Africa.
Hmm.
You can't occupy a continent anymore like they did, before and after the Berlin Accord back in the 1890s
Hmm.
with force of arms. What you have to do now is you have to propagandize the people and make them think like Westerners. So up until now, in places like the Philippines, all over Africa, many Asian countries, Oceania, a big family was a big blessing.
Hmm.
But now, after years of propaganda, a lot of the Africans are starting to believe this nonsense that we need to have fewer children. It'll make our country richer, it'll make us richer.
Hmm.
But all it does is make large poor families into small poor families. So we have spent something like $215 billion on population control all over the world since 1990. And two-thirds of that to three-quarters of that are in Africa. That's where all the
Wow.
expenditures take place. Now we
Wow.
have 300 million Africans who don't even have clean drinking water,
Hmm.
which is the number one health measure you can take to increase people's lifespans.
Hmm.
So instead of giving them what they need, like clean water, health facilities, good schools, good roads, and so on, we're just telling them have less children.
Hmm.
So what we're doing is, like Komodo Kane said, we are occupying their minds, trying to make them think like Westerners, that children are a bad thing.
I believe Pope Francis has referred to that as ideological colonization.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
the same
same
idea.
thing. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Colonization of the mind.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it is.
Interesting. So that's, you said there's two ways to control. So one is the
Yeah, through
ideological
arms. Yeah,
colonization. Oh,
through
and through
arms.
arms.
Yeah.
Right.
And through chemicals, the birth control pills, IUDs, the Depo shot, so on.
Hmm. So they use those as like their weapons
Yeah,
against
yeah,
birth. So this is jumping ahead slightly, but you mentioned that there was two reasons that, like, two driving motivations, which was racism and greed.
right.
You said most of the money has been spent in Africa. Is
Yes.
that due to racism or because natural resources are in Africa, or a combination of both?
I think it's a combination of both.
Okay.
Yeah, because a lot of it is racism because you see in the lighter skinned countries like South America, a lot of the Caribbean, Middle East, maybe $9 per person has been spent.
Hmm.
But if you look at the Aboriginal tribes of Africa, all over Oceania, you look at the Caribbean and Africa, it's more like $110. So there's a lot of money being spent. And the darker your skin is, the more money gets spent on you. But of course, there is also the idea that most of the resources are in Africa.
Hmm. It does seem though that this agenda has also been pushed on the United States and Europe. Like you do see this
Mm.
anti-natalist mindset. So was that intentional through propaganda, or is that like, I guess, did it originate in America and then they intentionally pushed it on places like Africa due to racism, or did they also intentionally push this propaganda among white people?
Well, they did push it among white people too for two reasons. One, we have to try it out here to make sure it works. I remember when I talked about Jaffe's memorandum-200. All these things we can try in the United States. If it works here,
Hmm.
then we can try it overseas.
Okay.
And the second part is that, face it, Europe and the United States consume a lot of resources.
Hmm.
And so there's that motivation in trying to hold down family size. And it's interesting, you can go to these big cities and you can go through the poorer neighborhoods and you'll see, the shabby looking houses and maybe the older cars. You see lots of children out there because the poor tend
Hmm.
to value children. And
Yeah.
then you go into these fantastically rich neighborhoods with the garage mahals and all that, and you won't see any tricycles or any balls or anything out there, and you'll see very few children.
Mm.
Like my father-in-law had 10 children on a very small salary. He said, children are expensive to raise. Only the poor can afford to have them. So people become selfish, and I think nobody has talked about this more than Pope Francis. Who
Mm.
says, we spend all of our money on ourselves, and we tend to not have children because we're losing the ability to love. We don't have enough love in our hearts to accept a third person into our family.
That's powerful.
It is. He's
Wow.
spoken very well on these topics.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. I know Father will highlight them sometimes in his Spirit and Life
Oh,
column.
yeah. Yeah. Many times.
So then what was the purpose of NSSM 200? Like what was it?
Well, it was the official policy on population control of the United States.
Wow.
It laid out the purpose, how it's going to be done, who's going to do it, and what the goals are.
Okay. So the purpose, what was the purpose?
So the purpose of NSSM is right up near the front. The U.S. economy will require large and increasing amounts of materials, especially from less developed countries. This gives the United States enhanced interest in the political, economic, and social stability of the supplying countries. Now, this is brought about by a lessening of population through reduced birth rates, which increase the prospects of this social stability. So, population policy becomes relevant to resource supplies and the economic interests of the United States.
Wow.
That's the
So
quote.
they just said it directly that they
Right,
want the
right.
natural resources.
Exactly.
Yeah, because I was started to read through it before this podcast a couple weeks ago, and I was struck by the fact that it was cloaked in this altruistic language of
Yeah, yeah.
there is this great concern in our world over famine and overpopulation, which, like you said, I think was springing from some real fears. But then you read it and it starts talking about the natural resources, and I was like debating, like, was this people who actually saw a problem and very pragmatically but evilly came up with like a deadly solution, or was
Oh,
it
yeah.
people that just were greedy? And it sounds like
Oh,
it's a little
yeah.
bit of both, but mostly greed.
Mostly agreed. This is a highly classified top secret document. They did
Hmm.
not anticipate that it would be declassified. And it says in the middle, this is a quote: the United States can help to minimize charges of imperialistic motivation behind its support of population activities by repeatedly asserting that such support derives from a concern with one, the right of the individual couple to determine freely and responsibly the number of children they have, and two, the fundamental social and economic development of poor countries in which rapid population growth is a contributive cause and a consequence of widespread poverty. So they say it right there. We got to cover up, man. We got to say
Hmm.
it's your right to have as many children as you want,
Hmm.
or as few as you want. And of course, they push for fewer. And
Hmm.
finally, the country will be poor if you have too many children.
Interesting. And that's like the same language you see today.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Alan Guttmacher, who is medical director of Planned Parenthood, said flat out several times, we have to have others represent us. Because if we go into, let's say, Nigeria as
Hmm.
white people and say, stop having children, they'll know that you're a bunch of racists. So what we do is we hire Nigerians from the elite, usually media personnel, and we have them do the job for us. So we give them a big salary and cut them loose to tell their own countrymen to stop having children.
Wow.
Yeah,
And yeah, that was Guttmacher, who the Guttmacher Institute is named after.
yes.
So you said that NSM 200 covered the purpose and then the plan. So what was the plan?
The plan was to get the middlemen operative here. International Planned Parenthood Federation, Population Council, Marie Stopes, Doctors Without Borders, the
Hmm.
single purpose population control groups, and like Doctors Without Borders, partial of their mission was population control, to get them to be funded by these big organizations. By these receiving countries. So if a country wants natural resources, it funds IPPF or the other population control groups that do the dirty work.
Okay, so you say like Western nations that want. So like the US
Right,
government would fund
right.
IPPF to then
Yes,
go promote abortion, sterilization, and contraception in the less developed countries.
right. It's all laid out not only by Guttmacher, but also in NSSM 200 itself, which you can find online many places.
Hmm.
So we have over 1,000 organizations now pushing population control all over the world.
Hmm.
Uh, Very few of them are single purpose, large population control groups, maybe 20 or 25.
Yeah.
The
So that would be
others,
like
yeah,
International Planned Parenthood, Population
right,
Council, Marie Stopes.
right, and ones like that. Others, to a varying degree, also push it because they see it as necessary to the development of the developing world.
So what nations did NSSM 200 target?
Well, there are 13 specifically named, and these are Bangladesh, Brazil, Colombia, Egypt, Ethiopia, India, Indonesia, Mexico, Nigeria, Pakistan, the Philippines, Thailand, and Turkey. They figured these have the most of an increase in absolute population every year.
Okay. And then was that also based on natural resources?
To a great degree, it was.
Okay.
It just happened to be that these 13 countries also have much of the world's natural resources, but
Interesting.
they're active everywhere. Like
Hmm.
I've been to Namibia now several times. It's a very large country in the southwest part of Africa. It's just north of South Africa and just south of Angola.
Hmm.
And they have one large city of maybe 300,000 there. That's Windhoek. And the rest of the country is virtually empty. They have like 10 people per square mile. All of the population control groups are there urging them to have less children because it's a very rich country in terms of natural resources, even though they only have about 10 people per square mile. I've
What?
driven across the whole country, 300 miles, and
Yeah.
you barely see any people at all.
What kind of natural resources are they talking about?
Primarily strategic metals like vanadium, magnesium, tungsten,
Okay.
the ones
S-
that are required for the war effort and for high technology.
So like not oil or natural gas or anything like that. It's more
Oh,
of
yeah,
like the metals.
yeah, though that's in the southern part. You'll find a lot of oil up in Nigeria, and
Okay.
that's one of the targets there.
Okay. So yeah, it just depends on the country then.
Yeah.
Interesting. Did NSSM 200, so like I said, it's cloaked in this idea that have to be concerned about the world's population because it's overpopulated and famines might have. Um, does it ever mention any providing any actual aid to people in those countries that they're targeting? Like any real help getting with like clean drinking water or dealing with famines other than decreasing birth rates?
No, not really. Yeah, you won't find much information on improving the living conditions of people in developing countries in NSSM 200, but you will find a willingness to use force. Here's one of the quotes right out of the document. It says, even stronger population control measures might be required, and some fundamental, very difficult moral issues need to be addressed. The conclusion of this view is that mandatory programs may be needed, and we should be considering these possibilities now. So, I have talked to many people around the world who have found that U.S. and the West-funded organizations like United Nations Population Fund,
Hmm.
UNFPA, have used force. The World Health Organization uses force. Like in Grenada, when they had a big hurricane down there back in, I think, 2004.
Hmm.
I was down there not long after that. A lot of damage was done. The World Health Organization came in and said, we'll repair all the damage for you for free, except first you have to eliminate prayer from the schools. And the
Wow.
prime minister said, forget that. We'll
Yeah.
repair ourselves. And within a year, they were back on their feet. And I've seen all over Asia, and especially in Africa, that this aid uh, is always accompanied by strings.
Hmm.
Like you will start to promote the LGBT agenda,
Hmm.
or you will legalize this kind of contraception, or you will legalize abortion.
That was what Genya, our affiliate in Ukraine, was telling us
Uh,
about the money going to Ukraine from the US, is that it's
uh,
coming with these strings attached of you have to
yeah,
promote LGBTQ ideology and abortion, or at
yeah,
least like
yeah.
endorse it or support it.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Very common all around the world.
And then that force would also probably be something like China's one child policy as well. Would that be another example of that?
Oh, yeah. Well, UNFPA was the one that designed that program.
Really?
They actually designed it and actually supplied the computers that helped them track the cycles of hundreds of millions of women all across the country.
So that's the United Nations Population Fund. I
UNFPA, right?
believe that the US government funds that, right?
Oh, absolutely,
Because
yeah.
I remember hearing that Trump had stopped the funding to it during
Mm,
his first term.
yeah,
And then
and Bush
Biden
had
started
also
it.
done that. Yeah.
Yeah, Biden started it up again though.
Yes,
And
yes.
I was looking into this for our ebook that we're writing on NSSM-200, and apparently in 2022, I think the US was like the second top donor to UNFPA.
Wow.
So, yeah. What like tools and weapons did NSSM 200 plan to use to reduce fertility rates? I'm guessing, obviously, you said using force to promote this. I'm assuming contraception,
Oh, yeah. Oh,
sterilization.
yeah. Abortion, the big three:
Okay.
abortion, birth control, sterilization.
Hmm.
All of them push very, very hard in all of these countries. I've been all through Africa. I've visited many of the countries there, and you see the effects.
Hmm.
These little medical clinics, they don't have any safe motherhood kits or any prenatal vitamin, just pallets of condoms and birth control pills and so on.
Hmm.
And you'll see in places like Uganda, Tororo, they have RHUs or reproductive health units and brand new white pickup trucks with all these emblems all over it of
Hmm.
who's supporting them. What they do is they get these young college age kids and they give them about a morning's worth of teaching on how to give birth control to women. And then they get a bounty of a dollar 25 for every one of women they can get on this birth control.
Follow the money.
Yeah, and so you have these poor women who may be taking two or three different kinds of pills. They got an IUD, which requires a little bit of medical expertise. You get them injected.
Hmm.
And in Tororo, in the central part, we saw these women who were on several different kinds of birth control because they don't tell them anything, no
Hmm.
informed consent at all. They were so sick and weak they couldn't even stand up. So we
Wow.
wanted to give them a talk under this beautiful tree, had to carry them out of the hospital, lay them in the grass, and talk to them about this is what's happening to you. So gross human rights violations just all over the place, and nobody seems to care.
The irony about all of that is
Yeah,
that December 10th is like International Human Rights Day or
right,
something
right.
like that. And I was like, I realized that it lined up with the anniversary of NSSM 200. And it was just like, what bigger violation of human rights can you
Mm.
have
Yeah,
than forced abortion, sterilization, contraception, like having a document that advocates for using force to
yeah.
reduce populations
In that same town,
or
there was
secrecy?
yeah, in that same town there was a Marie Stopes International Clinic, and one of their workers came over to us and said, "My conscience is bothering me
Hmm.
that we are advertising free malaria shots, but instead we're shooting out the women with Depo-Provera. So they're not protected against malaria. They're just having 3 to 6 months of sterility brought on by these shots."
Well, they also used vaccines, and I think it was like Mexico, Kenya, and the Philippines back
Mm,
in the 90s, where the tetanus vaccines were only given to women of childbearing age,
Right,
and then
15 to 44.
yeah, and then it caused it had something in it that caused them to have miscarriages later on.
Anti-HCG vaccine,
Yes, that
human
was it.
gonadotrophin. Yeah, we've seen this everywhere. Oh, it's
Mhm,
just an accident, just got polluted somehow.
mhm,
But if you look at the process for manufacturing these vaccines, it's impossible to do that
mhm.
unless it's deliberately added.
Well, that was I was looking through HLI's reports from the
Mhm.
90s. I
Yeah.
believe you gave me a binder with them.
Yeah.
And I was reading about that, and it was just going through like the science of how this would work. If you add
Mhm.
this to the vaccine, then you're creating antibodies, and your body
Mhm.
creates the antibodies for this HCG,
HCG.
and then your body needs that to when you get pregnant. So then when you get pregnant, your body creates the antibodies. So it was
Right,
like
right.
going through the whole cycle. And then a few days later, I was listening to Joe Rogan when he was talking to JD Vance, and he started quoting from Bobby Kennedy's book where they were talking about
Oh,
that. And I
yeah.
was sitting there being like, HLI was talking about this in the 90s. Like,
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
glad this is finally getting some attention.
I saw this in 1994 when I was over there.
Yeah, in the Philippines?
In the
Or
Philippines,
okay.
yeah. That's when it really got cranked up.
Wow.
In fact, I stayed with a bunch of religious sisters, Dominican religious sisters in
Mhm.
Davao City, who are also qualified as medical doctors.
Mhm.
And they noticed that a few years before, all the women in the entire countryside stopped having children. And
Whoa.
so they did an investigation. They found out that the U.S. funded Safe Motherhood Initiative was going to give them all free pelvic exams. While they were on the table, they put IUDs in all of them without telling them what they were doing. And so these religious sisters would spend half their day praying and half their day pulling these IUDs out of these women for free.
Oh my
And none of them
goodness.
knew they had an IUD in them.
Wow.
So we treat these women like cattle, not
Yeah.
human beings. It's another big thing that Pope Francis talks about, the dignity of the human person.
Yeah.
A total violation of that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting because like the pro-abortion groups always say that they're like pro-women. Like that's kind of been the
Yeah,
marketing
yeah.
that's been sold, the lie that's been sold to people. And it's like you actually look at what's going on and it's not pro-woman. It's not pro the preborn child who's a girl
Right.
because she's being killed. Like girl, preborn girls have rights too, but then it's also not pro-mother or pro like
Well, they actually vocally support this kind of thing. I remember Molly Yard, who is a president of the National Organization for Women, the most
mhm,
famous group. She praised the Chinese. She knew all about it. And she praised them. She actually speaks Chinese and went
mhm.
over there and actually saw everything that was happening. And then she gets up there in front of the camera and say, I approve of this forced abortion program.
Wow. How effective has the Kissinger report been in reducing the population?
Well, it's kind of like a linchpin. It's kind of like the first public statement of a major government to say this is going to be our official policy.
Mhm.
And so it's highly symbolic. So it's relied upon by countries all over the world.
Yeah.
And as several people have said, it'd be great if we could get President Trump to disavow this and say this doesn't care about human rights. This
Mhm.
treats people like cattle, literally like cattle.
Yeah,
It
that was
is,
gonna be one of my
yeah,
questions is Trump is like
yeah.
so like especially Elon Musk, who's working closely with Trump right
Mm.
now, is so concerned about fertility rates around the globe. It would be wonderful if Trump could rescind the Kissinger report and say like this is not official because it's is it
Yeah.
still official US policy right
It
now?
is. It hasn't been modified in any way.
I know it's still on the USAID website because that's
Right,
where I
right.
found it.
Oh,
And I can
wow.
link that in the description for
Oh,
everyone.
wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's still official policy. Now, there won't be any immediate practical effect if it's rescinded or modified heavily,
Mhm.
but it will be very symbolic.
Yeah,
You
of a
know, it's not
statement.
like if President Trump signs a document saying, okay, NSSM-200 is rescinded, all of a sudden the funding for population control dries up.
Mhm.
It won't happen. It has to be done separately.
Yeah.
But it is powerfully symbolic, kind of like Roe v. Wade.
Yeah. And it's a statement of saying like we do not support this, we do not condone this, and it like it hopefully will change the mindset or at least draw awareness to the fact that this has been going on and that the US does not support it anymore. And that kind of starts the ball, like it swings the pendulum. It starts it swinging back the other direction.
Right? Yeah,
You just mentioned the funding. How much has been spent on global population control
yeah.
since like the 70s?
1990.
Okay,
Since
1990.
1990s, the numbers before then are really scattered. They're hard to track down. But since
Before that?
19,
Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
but since 1990, $215 billion. That's alien with a B. That's 215 with 9 zeros after it. That's a ton of money.
Is that US tax dollars or just globally?
Globally,
Okay. So
the
that's,
main 14 major countries are the ones who donate more than 90% of that.
I know I've seen, I think Canada, the Netherlands possibly. I'm
Yeah,
trying to
the
remember the
Benelux
ones.
countries, the EU, the UK, Australia, New Zealand,
Yeah.
France, Germany, a couple of others. I can't remember them all.
Yeah, I've looked through IPPF's annual reports sometimes, and it's just like the
Hmm.
government from this country, the government from that
Yeah,
country.
yeah, oh yeah.
Levi Jeans, randomly,
Yeah, yeah, Levi jeans.
and a whole bunch of other ones. Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation,
Mm,
obviously. How, what's like been the breakdown of where that's spent? I believe you said most of it was spent in Africa.
70% approximately, 145 billion in Africa alone.
Okay. So then basically what happens is the US government funds groups like International Planned
Hmm.
Parenthood, Marie
Hmm.
Stopes, and then those groups funded by our tax dollars go and promote these in
Yes,
countries that
yes.
culturally don't want this.
That's right. LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, said that $5 invested in population control will return us $100 in resources. Yeah,
Whoa.
yeah, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So this isn't a partisan thing either. It's not like
Oh,
the
heck no.
Democrats are in favor of this and then the Republicans throughout the years haven't been.
Yeah, the entire elite is behind this. Let me read what President Nixon said when he and Kissinger were working on the NSSM-200. He said, in 1972, I think a majority of people are for abortion. Certainly in Michigan, they'll vote for abortion because they think what's going to be aborted generally are the little black bastards. As I told you, we talked about it earlier, that a hell of a lot of people want to control the Negro bastards. You know what we're talking about? Population control. And these are
Wow.
right off the White House tapes.
Wow.
So these guys are extremely racist.
Yeah, for sure. That is,
But we can
it's
look at
so
the,
tragic.
it is, we can look at the impact it's having on Africa. And what I love about, one of the things I love about Africa is the church hierarchy is really, really good.
Hmm.
This is Archbishop Ignatius Kagama of Jos, Nigeria. He said, now you Americans, you Europeans, come to tell us about reproductive rights. You give us condoms and artificial contraceptives.
Hmm.
Those are not the things we want. We want food, we want education, we want good roads, regular light, and so on, good health care. So the bishops are very aware of the problem.
Hmm.
And that's why the total fertility rate has not gone down so much in Africa as it had in the rest of the world. Because up north, you have the Muslims who are not going to listen to this kind of garbage.
Hmm.
And to a large extent, you have really good Protestants and Catholics
Hmm.
practicing in the southern part of Africa.
Well, and also like just to kind of bring up like how money that goes towards natural disasters in Africa is also being spent on this. I think it was United Nations. It might have been the United Nations Population Fund, so it might have been a group specifically focused on population control. But they were sending contraceptives to a drought-stricken area in somewhere in Africa. I don't remember what country it was. It might have been Zimbabwe. I'm not sure. I don't remember what country it was or Kenya. It was one of there was some country in Africa that was in a drought, and their solution was to send them birth control.
Yes, we've seen this several times. No
Hmm.
food, no
No
water
water.
purification systems or anything like that. Just here's a few pallets of condoms.
Hmm.
I hear the condoms are very chewy. They don't have much nutrition in them either. So, what good are those going to do to drought-stricken people?
And so it's still ongoing. Like I saw this like maybe 3 months ago. So this isn't
Yeah.
something that I think it's really easy to hear things like this with a document from 1974 and say like, surely this couldn't still be going on. And it
The,
hasn't, the policy hasn't been rescinded.
right.
We're still funding groups like the UNFPA, which are still funding groups like IPPF.
Hmm.
And there's clearly like they're proudly talking about the fact that they're sending contraception to drought stricken areas. So
Oh yeah. Oh
it's
yeah.
not it's not a conspiracy theory like some might pretend it
No, no.
is.
You see it all over the place. Everybody knows about it.
Hmm.
It is a conspiracy, but it's not a theory. All you have to do is go over there and take a look, talk to the people.
Or follow the money too,
Yeah,
of just
yeah.
like look where the money's
The
going.
money. It's always the money.
How have people in the countries that are targeted responded to this? Do they like know what's going on and they don't want anything to do with it? Have they bought into this ideology?
Well, the media is pretty corrupt over there, just like it is over here.
Hmm.
In some cases, even worse. The first time I was in Nigeria, there was a press conference I participated in, and you give envelopes to the media people, and if there's enough money in it, then they'll write you a nice story. If there's not, then they'll write against you. And this is why IPPF and Mary Stopes and the others has such an advantage because they can pay the media people
Yeah.
to write good stories.
Yeah.
And so most people have no idea what's going on. When we talk even to the nurses and the doctors over there, they have no idea what's going on.
Hmm.
And when they find out about it, they're absolutely outraged.
Yeah.
But there's an impenetrable, almost impenetrable curtain of secrecy over the whole thing.
Of secrecy about the corruption of the media or
Right.
secret? Okay.
The
Yeah.
corruption of the media and the fact that they're not getting the truth.
So the people that you've met in Africa
Mm.
have bought into this in general, or are aware of the like
They
the
have
fact?
bought into it in general, but the great thing about the Africans is that when they find out what the truth is, they will immediately flip and say, okay,
Yeah.
we understand, we get this. Now everything makes sense. Some of these questions I had,
Hmm.
the strange things that seem to be happening, now I
Hmm.
understand what's going on. Whereas if you get a European and talk to them about this, they'll stick with what they instead of in spite of all the evidence, they'll just continue to think the way they did before.
Interesting. Yeah, we have some great mission stories that come out of Africa of just like the
Yeah.
kids in Malawi last year who
Oh, yeah.
chased Planned Parenthood out of the school and set their box of condoms on fire when they showed up.
Yeah.
That's one of my favorite stories. I feel like I've brought that up on this podcast multiple times. We've talked about what would happen if Trump rescinded the Kissinger report. We also have the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, which is
No.
being headed up by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. I believe I said that correctly.
Mm.
And they, in their Wall Street Journal op-ed recently, said that they wanted to cut the $300 million going towards Planned Parenthood, I believe internally within the U.S. But they also mentioned cutting the 1.5 billion in grants going to international organizations. Do you think that this could include groups like International Planned Parenthood or other international aid organizations that are actually pushing population control? Do you think there's hope for
It
that?
there certainly is hope for that, especially considering that Musk is concerned about the plunging total fertility rates. So
Hmm.
I think that might be one of the first things that's on the chopping block.
I wonder if he ever saw any of this because I believe he was from South Africa and I don't know
Yeah,
how
yeah.
long he lived there. Like he could have just been born there and I'm not sure how long he lived there, but I wonder if he ever saw this going on over there.
Uh, yeah, I think he was pretty young.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
so he
just.
probably didn't have any idea, but he's got the best information gatherers working for him,
Mhm.
and I'm sure that he's becoming aware of it more and more all the time.
If they like are going through where the US aid is going, do they have to watch out for like language? Because I believe that the way that these population groups tend to work is they slip phrases like sexual and reproductive rights into these like large documents. And
Oh yeah,
if you
oh
don't
yeah,
know, you don't realize that this means that like within a whole chunk of money, certain percentage of it is going to be funneled towards population
oh
control.
yeah. Don't put anything past the population controllers. Like for years, I studied them because I wanted to know how can you tell when these guys are lying and when they're not lying. So I read books and watched videos about body language and all of this, and finally
Mhm.
figured it out. You watch them speaking when their lips are moving, they're lying. It's as simple as that. I've seen so many horrible things happen where, for example, the World Health Organization defines health of the mother as economic, social, everything that goes on in a person's life.
Mhm.
And so they put forth these bills all over Africa. We just want to save the life and the health of the mother, and that's very reasonable to the average
Mhm.
person. So you say, okay, we pass this bill, and bang, you got abortion on demand.
Yeah, because if the child causes her
Yeah,
one sleepless
yeah,
night,
yeah,
that's
that's it.
harmful to her
Yeah,
health.
they're not going to
Wow.
tell them about that. In fact, they've gone so far as with the Maputo Protocol to have certain countries like Tanzania, the parliamentarians there very carefully read the whole document and then signed off it on the next day, but it was a different document. They swapped the documents on them. That's how filthy these people can be.
Wow. Yeah, because I do remember reading about that, and I remember reading that
Mm.
HLI Tanzania was fighting it, and then I saw that it
Yeah,
had gone into
yeah,
effect, and I was like, "Oh, that's an unfortunate." I didn't realize that it happened
yeah,
underhandedly. I mean,
yeah.
I
Oh,
assumed that there
yeah,
was bribing and cheating and all that going
yeah,
on, but I didn't realize that they did something as
yeah.
blatant as switching the document out.
They demanded that those things like sexual and reproductive rights and health be taken out. It was. And that's the document they thought they were signing, but they weren't. They were signing the original document.
Apparently, going back to Musk, he's programming Grok to be able to read the omnibus bills and then summarize it like with his AI so that they can't slip
Oof.
anything in. And I'm like, we need something specific
Oh, my.
like that for like the sexual and reproductive rights for
Well,
you.
that's good.
You can
That's
scan the
good.
document.
Oh, yeah.
I hope that he includes that in his when he's developing that technology because I think that that would be incredibly helpful for catching when they change the document out overnight on you.
Yeah.
If they stop the funding to these organizations, what will that do? Will that fix the problem?
Oh, it'll fix a lot of the problem, but not the entire problem.
Okay.
When we worked on removing funding, we were the ones who, HLI was the ones who helped the Bush administration remove funding from USAID and UNFPA.
Okay.
And that was like $500 million a year for several years. And you
Hmm.
should have heard them scream. Oh my gosh, we have to shut down this many clinics because we don't have money. We can't do this, we can't do that. And whole areas in Africa had to go without sexual and reproductive health and rights.
Hmm.
Did those countries burn to the ground? No, the people didn't even notice.
Yeah.
But the pro abortion people did because they lost their jobs. They had
Hmm.
to go get honest employment. And these are not volunteers. They
Hmm.
make very big salaries. And if they don't get their money, they quit and go do something else. So it'll have a profound effect. It won't fix everything, but it'll
Hmm.
be a great start.
Yeah. I mean, there's still like 50 years worth of damage that you have to undo at that point and like heal the
Oh, yeah.
culture, but at least you could stop the like active promotion of depopulation going on.
Oh, yeah.
I know Father was saying that in Trump's previous term, when he stopped the funding to UNFPA, like our missionaries on the ground saw clinics close down because they couldn't receive enough funding.
That's
So
right. That's
if you
right.
then have Elon and Vivek going in there and just like slashing this funding like drastically, more drastically than just funding UNFPA, that could actually do hopefully do a lot of good, both like for Americans because our tax dollars wouldn't be going towards that, but then also for people in the targeted countries because they wouldn't have to deal with the van showing up with condoms or
Yeah.
doing pelvic exams
Yeah.
and slipping in IUDs without them noticing.
It'll also solve all of the drought situation over there. Rivers of tears from the pro aborts will be able to completely solve the problem of water shortage.
Well, I think that we have I think that we've covered a lot here. I don't know, is there anything else on NSSM 200 that you think is important for our audience to know for this episode today?
We have some materials online on that.
Mhm.
And if you really want the skinny on the document, read it.
Mhm.
Read the document.
Yeah.
It's much more exciting than the usual government drivel.
Yeah, I was surprised because I didn't realize that it was modeled after a United Nations document. And that's
Mm.
something that we've talked a lot about here with our mission to the Organization of American States and then hopefully starting up our mission to the United Nations next year, of just how important international policy is. And yes, as if you change a UN document, that might not like it's not you're not changing a law, but
Yeah,
then that
yeah,
document is what all these laws are modeled after. So it's
right.
really important that you don't let the corruption sink in there because as soon as it does, all these countries are going to follow suit. And so just realizing that the Kissinger report was modeled after a UN document kind of put some pieces together for me where I realized
Oh,
like
yeah.
again how important a mission to the United Nations is and how important like pro-lifers can't just wash their hands of the UN. Like it's important that we're involved there and that we make sure that their documents don't actually include sexual and
Mm,
reproductive rights and in their in the
mm.
phrasing. So,
So if you want to be more informed, you can read The Population Bomb and
mhm.
count those 80 wrong predictions. You can look at The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy by
Mhm.
Lothrop Stoddard, which is still a favorite among racists. It's all over the web.
Mhm.
You can watch Soylent Green. That's a lot of fun, too, where people are eating people in their
Mhm.
breakfast cereal. Uh, it's all very fascinating stuff. Very, very interesting what's going on in the world today. And it's wonderful to know what's going on and to be able to do something about it.
Exactly. Yeah, because you have to like know what you have to know the tactics. You have to know the enemy to be able to effectively fight it. So
Yes,
I feel
indeed.
like learning about the Kissinger report, exposing the fact that this is going on, talking about it, raising awareness, petitioning the Department of Government Efficiency and Elon Musk and Vivek to please stop this funding, petitioning Trump to ask him to overturn the Kissinger report. All of that is incredibly important to just raise awareness to the fact that this is going on. So please, to all of our listeners, please share this episode. Tag us on social media if you do, or if you're posting anything about this, because we would love to retweet it and get the news out there, because this is really important to spread the word about it. Um, we're also coming out with an ebook on this shortly, so I will put that in the description when it does come out so that you can get your own little summary of the document based on the articles that you've written, Brian.
Mm.
Did you have something else to share?
Yeah, just one last thing. We're up against $100 billion group
Mm-hmm.
of organizations, all the developing world countries. Just this massive apparatus has been operating with grim efficiency for years. But I like to quote Pope Leo XIII says, Christians are moreover born for combat, whereof the greater the vehemence, the more assured God aiding the triumph. Have confidence I've overcome the world. That's in the encyclical Sapiente Christiana. So it's the most important work in the world. Pope St. John Paul II told our founder, Father Paul Marx, and a lot of other popes agree.
Yeah, that is for sure. And one of these days, Brian, I'm hopefully soon, I'd like to have you and Father on to talk about what you've seen with the Kissinger report's impact immediately on the ground. Like you've shared some of your stories today of things you've
Yeah.
seen in these countries in your travels, and just talk about like how this has affected the people in their day-to-day lives over in places like Africa and Asia, and then also like how you guys set about with all your mission to try to heal the underlying solution. So keep an eye out for that episode. Hopefully, it'll come out soon, and I will link it on the end screen when it does. Thank you, Brian. This has been
Yeah.
a great conversation. I've really enjoyed learning more about this.
It is very interesting.
And thank you for
Thank
all the
you.
research you've
Uh,
done.
that's a wonderful job to do, believe me.
It's
Very exciting.
fascinating.
Yeah. It's a real conspiracy, not just a conspiracy theory.
Exactly. Conspiracy fact, I believe you said
Hmm.
one time.
Yeah, conspiracy fact.
And to all of our listeners, please like, follow, subscribe. Like I said, share this episode. Tag us if you do. We're on Twitter and on social media. We have a podcast and just HLI's normal account for both Instagram and Twitter. And keep on living the culture of life. God bless.